Can you see my screen, guys? Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So for those who don't know us, we're Serverless Toronto user group. We've been here almost 3 years now. And I just want to thank our knowledge sponsor, Manning Publishing. Like every meetup, they give a free book of your choice. So I posted a link in the chat. I'll post it again for the newcomers. And then you're going to do the survey here to help us be better. And we're going to draw the names at the end of the meetup to win any of their products. So thank you, Manning, if you're listening. And then we're not going to go deep into the serverless user group, what we're about, but we did start like a regular backend functions as service developers. But over the time, this enabled us to achieve more agility, and we now start defining serverless like the new agile in the mindset. And I find ourselves working closer with the product management folks. So it's this lean group that gave me the right to use this logo, lean product in California. And then also I would encourage you, because people with a mindset like us are going to really work well with the product managers. And there is a free conference on January 19th. I'll paste the link in the chat afterwards to meet like-minded people that we can build great products and help end users faster with what we're doing now. And we already have lined up 4 meetups for the next year. If you're a Java shop, or if you know anybody who is Java shop, like they are closer to being cloud native than they know. So in January, we're going to have a representative from Google, but he's going to be talking about Spring Cloud extension, Spring Cloud GCP. But same extension exists for AWS, for Alibaba, as of November last year. No, this year. It was November this year. They exist for Azure as well. So the benefit of this talk is going to show your employers and yourself that you don't need a platform on top of the cloud platform to run a Java application, whatever cloud you are. Specific example will be Google, but it's applicable across clouds, major clouds nowadays. And then in February, it's 3 years since we started the user group, so we're going to have a set of lightning talks, different topics, something about startups. We're going to have startup architect from Amazon talk about opportunities with your ideas. You click on the links, I'll share that. You can see the topics we're going to cover. In March, for the first time in 3 years, like after 3 years, we're going to have first Azure talk. I recently ran into Barry. He's from Netherlands. He is a Pluralsight author. He teaches people how to certify for Azure solution architect exams, and I really like his styles. So you're going to enjoy that. He's going to break down to newbies to Azure Cloud how to choose their services. So it's going to be a good talk. And then recently in the news, if you're following like Twitter and LinkedIn, there is this talk about the guy who got $72,000 bill for his startup. It was crazy. Like you get goosebumps when you just hear his experience. So he managed to settle that with GCP, but he's going to explain the mistakes he did and how to do architecture properly, so you're not surprised with bills like that. And in general, it's going to be useful for any public cloud user to hear that experience. And of course, like I'm asking you to rate the meetup, the more people rate us, well, we're going to show up in other people's feeds, so we're going to have more visitors in the future. And then this time, we are lucky to have James with us. Unfortunately, it's not in person like it was the last 3 rain events that we were there. But that's the best, life serves you lemon, we make lemonade out of that. And the rain event this year was 3 weeks long, but it stretches so long that it's hard to take time off work to have focused attention to the rain event. So even before it started, we knew it's going to be a good idea to have somebody like James give his spin at rain event, especially for the serverless folks. I also am looking forward to learn more what's coming and some predictions. And after we finish the presentation, then we're going to go through the Q&A with James, so if that's okay. So James, thank you for coming. I'm honored to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Let me just share the screen.
Bottom right.
Let's try this.
Yep.
Is that showing the right screen?
Beautiful.
Okay, great. All right, so welcome to the serverless recap. So this has been fun putting this together because obviously we've just had this whole marathon event. And normally we do these in January. So you're the first group to see this at all, but I've had fun putting this together. One of the difficulties, of course, is there's just so many releases and so many things going on. I'm trying to pull the things I think are most important to people in serverless, but I think I've got a reasonably good selection of different things that we've been doing. So for people who don't know me, my name is James Beswick, and I'm a developer advocate in the AWS Serverless group. So I've been building serverless applications for 3 or 4 years now, I guess, and I've been a DA for about 18 months. And before I was a DA, I was a product manager for quite a few years and also a software engineer for quite a long time as well. So I've built quite a few things. And I describe myself as a self-confessed serverless geek because prior to getting into serverless, I was trying to find a better way to do things. We had to manage 20 or 30 different projects, and the overhead of managing all this different infrastructure was really becoming a big problem for the developers that I was managing. So I stumbled across serverless by accident, and I went to Serverless Conf, where I took part in a workshop and listened to some presentations by people like Ben Kehoe and Chris Munns and all those people. And then I went away and used it to transform what we were doing with our business. So I saw what the power of it and how it could really help you when you're building and managing applications. And that's pretty much how I got involved. So today, I'm going to go through a lot of the things that have come out during reInvent, but obviously, most importantly, I'm here to answer your questions. So if you have any questions at all about anything that came out in reInvent or just generally about serverless, ask me anything, really, anything you prefer. I don't know the answer to everything. One of the things about working at AWS is that nobody does. You get a very small piece of the pie because there's so many different services. But if I do know, I promise to give you the answer. So looking at reInvent, this was my second reInvent as an employee. Last year was in person in Vegas. This year has been this virtual experience. And so I was thinking about some thoughts about how you compare the two, because traditionally, and I've been to reInvent many times as a customer, you have this very intense week where you do workshops and you go to sessions and there's running between casinos and all the craziness that goes with that. And this time it's been this 3-week-long experience. And, from the exterior side of things, you see everything happening through the website and everything going on. But internally, it's been very different for us. Obviously, like everybody, we've had to grapple with how to do this, given the new world that we live in. So I'm pretty pleased with how it came out, even though we went into this completely blind. And we had more attendees registered this year than ever before, mostly because obviously it's global and it's free and it's virtual, so that invites more people to what's going on. And in the end, we had 700 different sessions that went out. So yeah, hopefully there's something for everyone. And if you missed anything, most of those, if not all of them now, I think, are available on demand. So before we get into reInvent itself, I want to talk a little bit about pre-invent. So you might not know this, but the way that releases work on AWS services, we don't hold things back for reInvent. So what happens is that if something is ready ahead of time, it ends up going out early. And so this is why you get this very big pool of releases that happen just before the main event. But it's not by design. We're not actually holding things back at all. And often I think what's in this list is really interesting because often, for the things I build, there's often things here that are more important than what I hear about in reInvent. So I didn't want to leave this out for you. So I'll give you a quick summary of each of these things. I know there's a lot, so let's see how we go. So the first one was extensions. We launched extensions in preview for Lambda, and that gives you an easier way to integrate monitoring, security, and governance tools into Lambda functions. So you can also build your own extensions as well that run code during Lambda lifecycle events. And there's an extensions repo example that you can use if you want to go and build one. It's easier just to clone that repo to start building. Then there's the logs API, which is really a follow-on from extensions. So previously, you could only forward logs to a chosen destination once they'd been sent to CloudWatch logs. And so for people who are producing massive amounts of logs, obviously they don't want to do this. They want to be able to have more control over where their logs go. So the logs API lets you do this. And so this lets you receive log streams directly from the Lambda execution environment. And so you can now use your favorite tools to manage the logs. And that includes companies like Datadog, Epsagon, Lumigo, New Relic, Coralogix, Honeycomb, and Sumo Logic. Then we announced we were enabling Amazon MQ as an event source for Lambda. So MQ is a managed broker service that makes it easier to deploy and scale Apache ActiveMQ. So this integration is designed to increase the number of messaging services that integrate with Lambda, and many customers are using this. The event source itself operates in the same way as SQS and Kinesis, and in all of the cases, the Lambda service acts as a poller in the middle to poll for information to then forward to your target Lambda function. So we then released a new layer that made it easier to use Code Guru Profiler that helps identify the most expensive lines in your code. So this is very useful for enterprise environments for reducing cost. And then I think about a month ago, we announced private links. So this allows you to invoke Lambda functions that are within a VPC without traversing the public internet. So before this was announced, you had to put your Lambda function in a VPC if it was accessing certain resources. And then typically you'd need something like a NAT gateway, oftentimes, if you then wanted the Lambda function to connect to the internet. So this uses VPC endpoints instead to access the Lambda API. And so that can replace the need for an internet gateway or a NAT gateway. SQS batch window changed to 5 minutes. That's easy. And then we introduced code signing with AWS Signer. So for customers who want to have the guarantee that a Lambda function is running a certain deployment of code, this is very useful for them. So SAM CLI. So if you use any sort of framework to build your serverless applications, these are tools such as the Serverless Application Model, or SAM, or Serverless Framework. These are great ways to accelerate your serverless development. So SAM is the one that we're closest to in the serverless team. And many of our customers use this to build some fairly large applications. So a couple of these releases are really helpful. One is the cached flag. So previously, if you do a SAM build, it goes away and builds each one of the functions in your application. That can take a fairly long time if you have a large app. So what this does is it simply doesn't do that if nothing's changed in the function. So typically, if one or two functions have changed, it then doesn't go and then rebuild the other ones. So it's just really a time-saving feature. And the other flag, the parallel flag, enables those builds to happen in parallel. So if you've got 5 or 6 functions and they're all running npm install or going through the requirements txt in Python, you can do those in parallel instead of sequentially. So that can save quite a lot of time as well. So typically, I use both those flags now in my builds. And what I've seen is it makes the build process 80 to 90% faster. X-Ray is a service that enables you to gain observability into your serverless applications. It looks at what's going on through traffic across different services. And so over time, we've been adding more and more services to make that more complete. So very recently, both S3 and step functions became part of the X-Ray integration. So if you don't use X-Ray, it's really a good thing to plug into your Lambda functions. It can really help you troubleshoot when things start to go wrong in an application. EventBridge is something I'm a big fan of. You probably, if you read any of my stuff, you know I talk about it a lot, and we've been seeing lots of new releases for various things over the year. A couple of really interesting ones recently that I wanted to call out. The first one is the ability to archive and replay events. So this is fantastic if you deal with large numbers of events and you want to create development environments that can replay those events, or if you need to bring up other systems and hydrate them off of archives of events. This is a really simple way to do this. So essentially, you turn on the archive, it sits there and collects events as they go through the bus. And then if you need to replay them, you simply select a window of time and it'll replay them to your chosen destination. It's a really powerful feature. Resource policies have been made to be, I wouldn't say they're new, they're basically more elaborate now so that you can do things across accounts more easily. So we get lots of customers who are sending events from bus to bus on different AWS accounts. And previously, it was a bit more complicated to do this. So these resource policies we've enabled make it a lot easier for customers who have that kind of application configuration. And then last in EventBridge, there is encryption support. So this has been something we've been looking to do for a while, and we've now enabled SSE. So it's available by default when you set up a bus. Step functions, we're almost there. So a couple of the big things here are synchronous express workflows, which sounds like a mouthful, But when you look at step functions, it's simply designed as a way for you to build state machines across serverless applications. And so when you build those types of applications using step functions, what happens is you have a lot of asynchronous activity that can lead to more latency within a workflow. So sometimes you don't want this. Sometimes you want to have a synchronous workflow that you want to combine with an express step functions workflow. So this feature enables you to do that. So for very high speed, high throughput types of workflows, this is a really useful feature, and that just launched about 2 weeks ago. We've also been adding other things that step functions can talk to. So API gateway integration is a big one. So with this, what this means is that your workflow can now invoke API gateway directly as a service integration without you having to go through a Lambda function. Additionally, workflows can also query Athena as well. So if you've ever used Athena, this is a great way of querying data lakes. Now you can pull those results directly back into a step function. For SNS, we announced FIFO topics. That's first in, first out. So that's ordering within a topic. And then for DynamoDB, there are two major things that came out in the last few weeks, which were SQL-like language for querying a table. So Particle is a way of querying underlying DynamoDB tables without having to use syntax that's different to what you're used to. If you're used to using SQL, this is a really simple tool. And another change we made is the ability to take item level changes in the table and push those to a Kinesis data stream. So by default, they go to a DynamoDB stream. And the benefit of that is that if you want to create any sort of logic that gets called whenever there's a change to your data, it's a really simple way to build those types of workflows. But Kinesis data streams is something that a lot of people prefer to use, so now that's an option as well. And actually, a couple of things I forgot to mention, or one thing I forgot to mention on the left was AVX2 support, which I won't go into too much, but it's a really interesting feature where AVX2 extensions were enabled for Lambda. So for certain types of workload, it can make your Lambda function run a lot faster. Typically, these are data science or ML type workloads. So I have a blog post on that. If you're running that kind of workload, recompiling your libraries for AVX2 is a really simple thing to do. And the net result is that your functions just run more quickly and you can save money on your Lambda functions. So that's pre-invent. Now here are the main things that we announced during reInvent. And so the big one, at least in my mind, is 1 millisecond billing. This is a pretty dramatic change. Previously, what happened when you ran a Lambda function is you pay for duration. And the duration used to be rounded to 100 millisecond increments. So if your function took 10 milliseconds to run, you would still pay 100 milliseconds. Now with this change, it rounds to 1 millisecond. So you actually get much closer to the actual duration that your function is running. The great thing about this feature is you don't need to do anything to use it. It's automatically applied to all Lambda functions. It just is turned on across all regions, and it will be effective in the December statement you see from AWS billing. So this is a really interesting feature to me because, you know, functions can run up to 15 minutes, but the vast majority of Lambda functions, when you look at production workloads, run for under a second. Most of them run even faster than that. They'll run 100 to 200 milliseconds. So there's an opportunity here to really look at how you can change your architectures or change your Lambda functions to save quite a lot of money in the way that your applications run. So I wrote an article for Cloud Guru. I've put a link on the deck here. And I wrote this up very quickly but as soon as this came out because I thought there were some subtleties about how this works that might not be immediately obvious just from the headline 1 millisecond billing change. So one of the things that's really interesting to me is that these sub 100 millisecond functions that previously always rounded to 100 millisecond on the bill can be a real target now for saving a lot of money. And I'm seeing many functions where you can save 66% or more on the overall duration. So in this post, I highlighted a number of things you can do to make your function run a little bit faster. And whereas it wouldn't necessarily have mattered before to save 10 milliseconds here and there, now it does. So there are certain things you can do like reusing TCP connections, which sounds complicated, but it's actually just an environment variable that you turn on your Lambda function. or managing your dependencies. So, with Lambda, the size of your dependencies really makes a huge difference to how quickly the function runs. So you want to be on top of your dependency usage, and I suggest a number of different ways to do that. I talk about how you can do things in your init handler or your init code versus your handler. So the handler is the event that gets called when the Lambda function is invoked, and the init is all of the code outside that typically you use for initializing database objects and other caches and other types of libraries. And then finally, I introduced the AWS power tuning tool, which is Alex Castleboni's really great open source tool. And what this does, if you take a Lambda function and throw it into this tool, it'll run the Lambda function at a variety of different memory settings. So why does this matter? Well, so memory in Lambda is a bit more complicated than it looks. You have a choice of memory from 128 megabytes and upwards. But as you turn that dial, you're also turning up the amount of virtual CPU available and also the amount of networking available. So that dial, the memory lever, is more like power. So one of the things you can do is go through your functions and try and see how they perform at different memory levels to see what the different execution times are like. And the AWS power tuning tool, Alex's tool, does this for you automatically. So if you implement this, it'll simply run your function against a variety of different configurations and tell you the optimal trade-off between the amount of memory and the level of cost. So I always thought this was a great tool, but now with 1 millisecond billing, it actually makes an enormous difference to how efficient your functions can be. Anyway, there's more details in that blog post, that link, that's well worth checking out. If you have any questions on that, obviously let me know. So another major change was the amount of memory available to your Lambda functions. So for a long time, it's been limited to 3 gigabytes of RAM. And we've now increased that to 10 gigabytes. So this is very useful for compute-intensive workloads. We have a lot of customers who are using Lambda for things like machine learning and genomics and gaming and high-performance computing. And all of these, the amount of CPU, the amount of memory available is really important because it controls the amount of CPU. So what you'll see on this table here is now with these larger amounts of memory, bearing in mind that the memory is a lever for power, it shows you the amount of virtual CPU that becomes available to your function. So the lowest possible setting at 128, you get a fraction of a CPU. At around 1.8 megabytes or gigabytes, you get 2 CPUs. But at the maximum setting, you get 6 different virtual CPUs available. So this is something definitely worth thinking about in terms of when you select your memory for your functions. So it's not always as simple as thinking, well, my function doesn't need that much memory. It's more about the compute that you're bringing to the function as well. Now, the third big one here is container image support. So it's really important to know what this is and what it isn't, because I heard a lot of people when this was announced saying, oh, this is Lambda running containers. And it's not that. So it's really important to know that it's not Lambda running containers. But what it is, it's an ability for Lambda to support container image types of packaging. So this doesn't change anything about the way that Lambda invokes a function. A lot of the same things are true in terms of there's an API that triggers your the event that triggers your code. The same sort of integrations are the same with all the different services that you can connect to. It's still pay-per-use. It still automatically scales. A lot of the environmental factors around Lambda are completely unchanged. But what we did this for is that we have a lot of customers who are actively using container tooling as a primary development workflow. Until we did this, what they had to do is essentially step away from that workflow and then use our method of deploying and packaging their functions. So this enables the developers and operators who want to use the container packaging, but they also want a simpler deployment experience to use Lambda. So there's a few interesting things about this that are not immediately obvious when you start playing with this. You have access to 10 gigabyte container images when you use this approach, whereas typically when you're using zip deployments, you're restricted to 250 megabytes. So this is the way to use much larger deployment packages if you need to. And so really this is targeted towards customers who are doing things like machine learning inference. Often models can be very, very large. This is a really simple way of bundling your model along with your code. So if you're doing inference in a Lambda function, you can bring in models that could be several gigabytes into the function. It's also great for analytics, or if you have large dependencies. It's surprisingly common how many libraries now are just slightly bigger than the 250 gigabyte limit that we're trying to work, or 250 megabyte limit that we work around with zip deployments. And so this is a way of you using those sorts of libraries as well. So we've done a lot of different presentations on this. I summarized some of the thoughts at this blog post I wrote in the bottom left, the S12D/OCI. I wrote another post for A Cloud Guru where I show how you can use this, because I think a lot of people thought this would be very complicated. And in fact, it's not fundamentally that different. So I'll walk you through the workflow of what it looks like. So to use a container image in a Lambda function, this is what you do. You essentially use Docker to build your container image. And then the first thing, you push it to Amazon Elastic Container Registry, ECR. And then when you create your function, what it does is you specify where the image is in ECR. It pulls that image down from ECR. It does some optimization on the image, and then it deploys it to the Lambda service. And then at that point, it's ready for invocation. Now, what's really interesting here, and is a little bit subtle, is that when typically you're looking at the 250 megabyte limit for zip file type packaging, the larger your package gets, the worse your cold start performance, because what's happening is internally, it's copying all that code from S3. And it's just a physical limit on how quickly you can copy that amount of data. What we've done here, because the images can be up to 10 gigabytes, is we've basically optimized that storage to be much closer to the servers. And there's various other optimizations as well, but it essentially means that even with the very, very largest containers, you have a relatively fast startup time that you wouldn't have if we simply stuck with the ideas that we're using before at the 250 megabyte level. So this process here can make it actually pretty quick to run some fairly large container images. Now, by doing this, in this article I was referring to, I showed there's about 3 or 4 commands you have to run with Docker to tag your image correctly and push it to ECR. But the simpler way to do it is to use SAM. So the latest version of SAM that was released, I think, a week or 2 ago, will do all this for you. So if you're used to using SAM already, all you have to do is package the container, and it will then, we run SAM init, SAM build, and SAM deploy. And as you do those things, it will do everything under the covers for you. So all those different things I was showing you on the previous slide, they still happen, but you don't have to think about how they work. And so when I was playing with this, I found this really useful, because when you're doing it manually, there's kind of a manual element to typing in these commands over and over as you're making changes to code. By doing this, really it becomes a one-line command that you're doing to update your functions. So I highly recommend checking out SAM if you're interested in using container images for deployment. Now, I also talked a little bit about extensions. Now, I'm cheating here because this is pre-invent, but I think it's really interesting just to mention a couple of things here. So, you can drop an extension into your environment by adding a Lambda layer to your function, and then by adding some configuration information using environment variables, and that can then consume the capabilities of an extension. And you can also build your own extensions using the extensions API. And that allows you to hook into this Lambda lifecycle that we've exposed. And the extensions themselves can use the logs API, which we talked about, to get log data from the Lambda service. So there's a lot of information around this. And I just wanted to show you these 3 different resources we have for learning about them. But it's surprisingly easy. And really, this opens up the way that Lambda works, allowing you to extend the capabilities in lots of interesting and new different ways. One of the notes I added at the bottom here I thought was pretty important is that most customers who've been using this actually use it without knowing too much about how it works, because when you look at the example project, it handles a lot of this for you. So how do you deploy extensions? So these can be deployed as Lambda layers, and if you've been doing Lambda layers so far, it's the same process. You can use the console, the CLI, CloudFormation, SAM, serverless framework, etc., etc. I mean, really, whatever your preferred method of packaging, you can use that to build a layer. And you can also include extensions inside a Lambda container image as well. So if you are using the container image packaging, that's how you would bundle that into your container image. And then you just simply add that image layer, and your function is ready to consume that. So some other things I wanted to call out, which aren't directly in the line of sight with some of our big releases, but I think they're really also important. On the Lambda side of things, we've got self-hosted Kafka as an event source. So many customers are running their own Kafka servers or clusters, both on-premise and on EC2 instances as well. And this enables you to trigger Lambda functions from messages that are going through your Kafka instances. So one of the really interesting parts about this is that if you're looking to move from on-prem to the cloud, often moving these types of environments is kind of difficult. This enables you to strangle things across. So if you wanted to move functionality from a local on-prem application towards a serverless application, this actually makes it surprisingly easy. Secondly, we announced streaming analytics with tumbling windows, which sounds really amazing, but actually what it does is this gives you the ability to compute analytics in real time from Kinesis and DynamoDB streams using Lambda functions. And the way it works is that each time you have a tumbling window is simply an amount of time, so let's say 30 seconds, and it occurs in non-contiguous windows. So you might have window number 1, followed by window number 2, followed by window number 3. For each one of those windows, your Lambda function is invoked, and then you perform some computation on that information, like maybe you sum some sales or average tickets, and then you provide that summation to the next Lambda function. So you return a state back to the caller, and the next Lambda function in the next tumbling window receives that state. So I wrote a blog post about this, and essentially within about 15 or 20 lines of code, you can build a real-time streaming system that's really pretty easy to implement. So it's actually exciting if you're doing things like working in organizations where you have point of sale systems in lots of places, and you wanted to collect aggregate stats. It's really a very simple way to do that. We've also announced custom checkpoints for streaming event batches, which is another one that sounds very complicated, but isn't as bad as it sounds. So if you're using Lambda to process batches of data from Kinesis or SQS or any of these types of batch-driven systems, what typically happens is that you get given a batch of messages, which could be anything from 1 to up to 10,000 messages. And if your Lambda function fails for any one of those messages because you have a runtime error, the entire batch ends up being retried. Now, that's not so bad if you're taking 10 or 100 messages at a time, but obviously if you're dealing with thousands, that's not great. So prior to this, there are a couple of different ways of handling it. You could do this feature called bisect on error, which basically split the batch into 2 and try it again, and it kept doing that recursively. But this method is actually fairly straightforward. If your batch fails on message 7 out of 10, your function simply returns back the ID of where it failed, and the next batch you get called with starts at that checkpoint. So it gives you much more precision about how you control batches in streaming events. X-Ray Insights was announced in preview. This is a really interesting service. I mean, generally speaking, I think X-Ray does a lot for people in terms of observability. It's very easy to implement, switch on, and it simply sits there. And when you have a problem with an application, it makes it a lot easier to find where the problem is. Insights is a new feature that makes it easy to spot anomalies in your application. So if you've run any sort of distributed application before, typically when errors occur, there tends to be some sort of build-up to it happening. You'll start to notice queues are building up, or certain functions aren't doing what they're supposed to. And often you don't know about those things until something more serious goes wrong. Insights can be useful because it starts to spot these anomalies and notifies you. So it can be a great way of getting warning before things go wrong. The AWS SDK for JavaScript version 3 was launched, and this had a couple of things that are really impressive. Normally I wouldn't mention SDK releases because they happen really pretty frequently as new services and features are added. But if you're JavaScript, there's 2 really important parts of it. One is that we now have support for TypeScript, which obviously many people really want to use TypeScript. And this is first-class support, so that's a first for the SDK. And the second is modular architecture. So, I spend a lot of time talking to people about how you trim down the amount of SDK you bring in when you're importing it, because you might only be using 1 or 2 services, and pulling in the whole package can be fairly wasteful. And before, we used to have a way of doing that, but now it's actually much simpler, because with the modular architecture, you're importing at the service level instead of importing the entire SDK. So this is something you can retrofit into your existing Lambda functions really pretty easily as well. SQS announced a high throughput mode for FIFO queues. So now that can allow you to process up to 3,000 messages per second per API action. So that's a 10-fold increase compared to the current FIFO queue throughput quota. So this is something that's really important to anyone who's building applications where ordering is important. This is actually a big change for them. AWS Cloud Shell, I personally really love this one. I had no idea this was being announced, and when it did, I was super happy. What it is essentially just a terminal window that lives inside of your console. Everybody has access to one. It's free, you don't pay for it, and each Cloud Shell has 1 GB of storage per user per region. So you can use Cloud Shell to do things like run SAM or run AWS CLI commands, or do things like SSH into EC2 instances, and all of that you can do without spinning up any type of EC2 instance or Cloud9 instance. It's just a terminal window that's waiting for you to use it. So we're pretty excited about that one. And then S3, strong read after write consistency. So this is a fascinating release where, if you've used S3 for any period of time, it's a service I've always had a lot of time for, because it stores an enormous amount of data. And under the covers, it's not one service. It's actually hundreds of different services that integrate together to make it work. But of course, one of the side effects of that is eventual consistency, that what really happens is that when you make changes to data and you put data in there, and then if you immediately query the same object, you might not be querying the same AZ or the same service. And so there can be a lag between data being written and data then becoming available to a service that requests it. And so eventual consistency has been something we've lived with S3 for as long as I've been using AWS. And you come up with all sorts of clever ways of working around it. But this is especially a problem if you work with data analytics or you work with data lakes, where data lakes often expect to have immediate access to new data. So with this change, now every single write you make to S3 has strong read after write consistency. So immediately you have a response from your put operation saying that the object's been written. It's now immediately available. So technically, under the covers, that's pretty impressive how they've managed to pull that off. But I think that's going to be really helpful for anybody who's building large data-driven applications on S3. So over the course of reInvent, the DA team that I'm a part of, there are 6 of us on the team, and each of us presented a different session during reInvent. All of those sessions are now on demand, and I put links here, but you can find this if you log into the reInvent website and search for any of our names or these session titles. You'll see these too. So I gave a session on talking about how you decouple serverless workloads with EventBridge, and that was really designed for people who are building larger applications or enterprise apps. Chris spoke about optimization of serverless apps, and there's probably nobody who knows more about this than Chris. So if you're interested in fine-tuning your Lambda applications, that's a great session to see. Rob on my team really knows a lot about how you secure serverless applications, and often there's not a lot written about this topic. So I thought his session was really interesting, because there's a lot of tips there if you're building any type of production app that are well worth considering. Eric discussed API Gateway, and really focused on the new HTTP APIs and what they're capable of doing. So HTTP APIs were launched a year ago, and the main benefit at the time was that there's a lot cheaper and often a lot faster. And so now they actually have a lot of feature parity with REST APIs, and Eric went into that. Ben was talking about the LAMP stack for PHP developers. So people forget that Lambda functions have native runtimes like Node and Python and Java and .NET and all these other ones. But you can also bring your own custom runtime. So what Ben has been working on over the last year is a series of different projects showing for PHP developers how they can use this new LAMP stack, that essentially Lambda is the L in that LAMP stack. And his presentation is really the summation of a lot of what's going on there. Really, really interesting. And then finally in the list, Julian and my team talked about observability. And this is something where I don't think we talk about this enough generally in building applications, but typically if you build any sort of production app, you only start talking about observability when something goes wrong. And really you want to be thinking about it in the building process. And so Julian talks a lot about different things you can do. And I know observability often causes developers to glaze over, but actually it's fairly easy to implement if you want to build it in at the right stages. So those are the 6 different sessions that we gave. But I'd highly recommend checking out the replays if any one of those topics is interesting to you. So reInvent isn't done yet. You'll be glad to hear that we've done 3 weeks so far, and we've got more to come. So in January, in the week of the 12th to the 15th, there will be more sessions. I think they said 300 are coming out. And this is really just a session-only section. There are things we couldn't fit into the agenda in the first 3 weeks because of the way that we planned for multiple time zones in the first batch. So this is kind of a spillover, but lots of really interesting sessions have now appeared in the catalog. So it's well worth checking out the catalog and seeing what's available there. I have 2 sessions in that window that are 2 topics I really enjoy talking about. And both of them actually are chalk talks that I did in reInvent last year, but now we've changed them into sessions. So the first one is S3 to Lambda, about how you can use that pattern at the core of building serverless applications. This is something I'm really interested in as a topic. Essentially, you can build extremely scalable, very high throughput applications by putting S3 in the middle. And so in this session, I show 6 different applications. I have a variety of different proof of concept apps you can download and try yourself. But often it's a great place to start when you're building your new apps. And then my second topic is about thinking serverless. So this is really designed for people who are new to serverless as an idea. And I show how you can go from really a flow chart and a diagram on a piece of paper to building out a serverless application. So last year when I did this, I was using a whiteboard, and that got kind of sketchy at times because my handwriting isn't great. But this time they're actually using diagrams. So I walked through 3 fairly common requests, the sorts of applications that you might want to build in a business, and how you could go about developing those serverlessly. And then for each one of those ideas, I then introduce new requirements after you've built the application to see how that changes things. So both of those sessions are ones I really enjoy giving, so definitely check those out. Also, I just wanted to throw in here, we've got a fairly new website called Serverless Land. And so what we're doing here, this is run by the DAs currently. We built this as a central resource for places to learn about what's going on in serverless. So it consists of blogs and videos and training courses, a list of events that are coming up, and all sorts of things. As we find them, we put them here. We're going to be developing this even further in Q1 of next year, but right now we've got hundreds of different things on there. It's a great resource if you're new to this whole thing and you're looking to figure out what's going on and how to learn the next important thing in the serverless space. But all of that's available at serverlessland.com. Okay, so that's my super fast whiz through everything that's new at reInvent and pre-invent and a few of the things coming up in January, but I'm happy to answer really any questions you have at all.
Thank you, James. Like always, excellent presentation. I want more.
There's more coming in January.
So for the guys in the chat, you're going to get the slide deck after the meetup. I'll reshare what James shares with us.
Yeah.
So it's Q&A time, guys. Any questions? Like when we were starting this, I was thinking of the question like for the new guys, how to start going serverless. You just answered that with the last slide. So because things change so quickly and it's hard to be up to date. So the links I was sharing before, they're out of date. So, and then also one of the question was about people using like AWS using serverless, but like half of the new announcements at the reInvent were serverless managed services. So So which are your favorites? Like what beside here? Like there is anything else like that's not directly related to Lambda?
Yeah, it's really interesting being on this side of the fence because we don't find out about any of these releases before anybody else does, and so we're listening to what's going on as fast as we can. And it's you only really get to the point where you're in the Christmas period. You take a few days off and you can really digest what's happened. So I've heard a few things from other teams, but it seems like there's a lot that's exciting that's happening in the SageMaker space. That the whole ML space is starting to really produce a lot of interesting features. I want to really become much more acquainted with that. I think not so much a feature, but one of the things that I found really interesting in Andy Jassy's keynote, which I wasn't aware of before this, was the fact that in Amazon.com, which is the retail side of what we do, nearly 50% of all the workloads that were built in 2020 were serverless.
Wow.
And what I find this interesting because Amazon.com is really a customer of ours. Even though it's the same company, we don't actually have any insight into what they're doing. They have the same sort of process of getting tickets raised and feature requests as any other customer. And so when I heard that, I thought that was fascinating because they're building a lot of things really right on the cutting edge. And I had no idea that they were that close to really fundamentally going all in. So that was one of the interesting things that I picked up.
And then, like, normally it's end of the year, so we use this because Amazon started with cloud computing, started with serverless computing. So people are looking at Amazon for what's the next big thing, like what do you expect in 2021, besides COVID to go away.
Yeah, so this is another thing I think is definitely peculiarly Amazon. It's an Amazon-only thing, but what's coming up around the corner is very easily predictable when you look at AWS. Because everything on the roadmap comes in from customers. So unlike many places I've worked where when I was a product manager, a lot of ideas for products really came from senior management more than anything else. Everything on our roadmap, really probably 90% plus, comes directly from what customers are asking. So it does actually make it relatively easy to sometimes predict what's coming up, just because you hear a lot of people saying they want the same thing. It's fairly likely that will happen. But it also turns to the second side of that, really, how do you get the things that you want built? Because essentially, in many companies, I don't think anyone necessarily care what we as developers want to build. But the way we build things, every time I speak to PMs, the first thing they ask me is, what the customer's asking for. So if you want to see anything released at the next reInvent next year, just ask me. It's if you've got a good use case, I have a great line into PMs, and that's how we get things built. But it's funny because last year was my first go around of this, and I'd been a customer for years, and so I came armed to my job with my shopping list of things I wanted, and several of these things got built. So it definitely works as a process, but it does mean that when we're thinking about what happens next year, I think there are some general themes that will continue to be the case. Clearly serverless is growing so quickly at this point. It's shocking. I mean, there's trillions of invocations a month happening in Lambda. There's hundreds of thousands of customers using this. All across every region, every type of customer, every industry vertical, we see serverless becoming a preferred way of doing things. But I think our challenge is, how do we reach all of these developers who are new to what's going on? Because, I was there 3 years ago. I know what it's like. It's yet another technology you have to learn. And, is it worthwhile? Is it just another thing you have to chase? I know from being in that position. So, I'm mostly interested in how do we reach all the new people who are coming and help them get up to the speed as quickly as possible and not have to go, I want them to get value out of this whole system very quickly.
So the biggest issue so I just come from a company where I was the enterprise architect for 45 people, and I really pushed for serverless based development first. And the biggest problem I had with people was they were used to developing for containers, and they're used to connecting to a container to debug.
Yeah.
And basically, so we had situations where had to watermark really, really large images. And on your desktop, that works fine when you're running in the serverless framework or in SAM. You have enough memory to decompose this really large image. But as soon as you throw that into Lambda, so they'd write this, they'd be happy with it, they'd deploy it. And then in Lambda, the memory space isn't sufficient. Now, granted, there's the new 10, the 10 gig model, which will probably suffice. But some kind of ability for them to attach to this thing to see what's going on would save all of that, all of those cycles of trying to discover what the necessary problem was. And I think that's the biggest thing that I think that that people were encountering in this company I was working in. I'm just throwing that out there, and that's something I'd like to see from an adoption perspective, not necessarily from a workflow perspective. And granted, it would be of obvious value there, but this is instead of changing people's means of thinking, giving them the crutch that they're used to some extent.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think getting the developer experience to match what people are used to is part of the trick here, because when I first started, I started in the console because I just couldn't find any information about how I was supposed to do this, and almost gave up several times because you just think, God, how are you going to continue developing this way? And then, as you start to get it more closer to working in VS Code, whatever platform you're in, and making it more part of your natural process, then it's not so jarring. But it's something we speak about a lot, because obviously you're going from this new paradigm idea, trying to make it work the same way. And there's obviously some very, very big differences in terms of, most of the time you're invoking real cloud resources. And there are other limitations around how the code is run you wouldn't necessarily have on your machine. But I think we're going to get there. I really think there's a push, that people want to see that. And I do think it's one of those hurdles once we cross, will be really fundamentally different for new developers coming on.
Well, we can hope so.
Yeah.
So I would send folks, especially leaders in the company, to Adrian Cockcroft's talks. He does explain for executive level, thinking how it's why it's better to do serverless. So you did not include it in your list, but I was looking at his talks as well. They're more architecture strategy oriented. So
I think he's interesting because he has a presentation that goes into a lot of how serverless fits in for people at the kind of CTO level and that strategic level.
Yeah.
And I think
the link. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you're in their position, a lot of it is this just another new thing? And a lot of it is it's changing in flight as all these new features and things happen as well. And so I think his presentation really sets the stage well in terms of explaining how it fits into the picture.
Mm-hmm.
But the way we see it, because often people come up to us and they think we have some sort of fight going with containers, but really there's a continuum of different environments people are using that most customers we speak to, many have mainframe systems, many have on-prem servers and they're in data centers, some are using EC2, some are using Beanstalk, many are using containers, many are using serverless. And so really, as you get to a certain size of organization, chances are they have everything at some level, but it's just a matter of how do you easily help them deliver value in their workloads.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a Jeffrey Moore adoption pattern, right? There's those that are much further, that are a little less mature in terms of that, are still in containers or what have you, and it comes. It's continuum that happens over time. But
I strongly believe that the fundamental reason I got involved with it was that being able to sidestep the management side of dealing with running, sudo yum update at the weekends on servers and patching things and wondering why things are, all of this goes away, made it worth learning this alternative way to build things. And so when I came to it, I didn't know an enormous amount of distributed computing or any of these concepts. And they are stumbling blocks when you go from building these monolithic apps to figuring out how you're going to split things up across services. But occasionally still I have to fire up an EC2 instance and it's like, I'm glad I don't have to do that most of the time, because it's just nice the fact the code runs and you don't think about it too much.
But you were the startup owner, you had to deliver products quickly, so
yeah,
what's easier, not what's more fun as a developer.
Yeah, I mean, my business before I worked at AWS, it was we built applications for startups. And we had a business where we only had 2 customers. They were family funds that basically threw money at startups. And we built the technology for their startups. But after a couple of years, we had a couple of dozen, 25 to 30 different apps where we'd been paid for them, and the developers have all moved on to other things, but we're having to still make sure that they run and operate. And just cognitively, it becomes harder and harder. And I just remember wondering, how would I scale this business if I couldn't get out of managing the infrastructure? And so it was very fortuitous the way this came in my lap. But it's funny now because I have a lot of apps I wrote 3 years ago that are still out there when I demo things. And they still work. You know, I can go on stage and fire up a URL and they still work, even though I've not touched anything in the application stack for a couple of years. And every time that happens, I feel it reminds me of the value of approaching things this way.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. Thank you for sharing. And you started as Python developer and then moved. It was.
Yeah, I've always been fairly pragmatic. I learned C++ at school. My very first job at school, after I left college, they didn't touch C++ at school at all, and I was thrown into the world of using like Visual Basic and then .NET and then Perl and all the other things they can think of using. And so over time, you just start using any tool that gets the job done quickly. And then Python I used for a long time, and I thought this it's a great language. But I use Node a lot today simply because in these services of passing JSON around all the time, it's a good natural fit. But then I'm also excited by what I see coming out of Go, especially with these billing changes. The race now is to really find function invocations that will run for 1 millisecond, not 20 milliseconds, because suddenly you're paying 5% of the price. And Go is a runtime that will deliver that for you. We see a lot of people running incredibly fast functions. So I have no real affinity to any one of these tools. They're simply ways that we can deliver more value more quickly, more cheaply to me.
But you see, guys, that's a mindset. That's what you're talking about. That's why I like James and Ben Coyle. Like it's about just choosing any tool that going to get you faster to the customer. And managing server is not in the path if you can get away from it.
Yeah, and I say this to lots of new developers who are coming out of school. It's hard learning your first language, isn't it? Once you get your mind into how all this works, it's tricky. And so you do definitely feel that you've got some ownership over one of that first languages that you learn, and so it makes you not necessarily want to learn the second one. But I think it's something, one of the most important skills you can have is to keep moving with what you learn in these different tools.
Mm-hmm.
And they say to a lot of these people who are just getting into their careers that this is like the technology equivalent of working in Hogwarts. I mean, there aren't many different businesses where you can simply build ideas out of nothing. And it's as close as we'll ever get to magic. So the more tools you have, they're like spells in your toolbox. I mean, essentially, they're just going to help you deliver this. But it is pretty remarkable when you consider that really you're operating in thin air. There's nothing there. And you can build whatever you want.
Amazing. Guys, any other question like for James? John and I, we were going through the list of questions to ask him before. We pretty much answered everything. One of them was about the runtimes. You just answered Go is the fastest one. Java is probably the slowest. Any other
the one I have is so startup latency. I mean, you sort of touched on it. Startup latency in the container, the OCI-based model versus the zip-based model. It had totally escaped me that zip was still limited to 250.
Yeah.
But what kind of startup latency are you seeing, and what kind of startup latency? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so at the moment, what I've seen so far, if you run the largest size at 10 gigabytes, you're looking at sub 1 second, fairly, standardly across any region, any type of application. You can use provision concurrency with this too. So if you really needed to get rid of the cold start, you could turn on provision concurrency, and you get the same sort of double-digit latency out of that. But I think obviously lots of people want to see larger zip files too. That's something that's been talked about a lot. And the challenge is really, how do you get this technology we've built that accelerates the loading of the 10 gigabyte platform to work with zip files? And I think we'll be looking at some of that this year. But certainly when we first started doing this, and we were using the same approach of copying a 10 gig object basically from S3, it was substantially slower. So this optimization process has really managed to get the cold starts down to pretty reasonable level right now, but we'll continue making it faster. That's the one thing I can tell you about AWS is people love making things faster.
Customer obsession, yeah.
People, people get excited when they start talking about shaving off milliseconds off things. So I'm sure it's going to get much quicker.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks.
I have a question related to that the Lambda container thing as well. If I'm using a container as the packaging tool to get it going, at runtime, can you still bind to a layer and mount that at a certain point in your path and do the thing that you do when you do the code method of deploying?
Yes, it's different though. So Julian in my group wrote a couple of blog posts on this to go through it, because it was one of the first questions we had was how do you use the existing tooling there? And it's like everything. Once you see it done once, it's not too difficult. But he has a good blog post on the compute blog that explains the whole thing.
Okay, I'll check that out. So for example, like I have some layers that contain, the binaries for Oracle drivers. So at runtime, my Lambda connect to Oracle instances and so on and so forth. If I was using a Docker image as the packaging tool, I would still be able to bind those same layers, or would I include the Oracle stuff in my container?
Well, that's what he was working out, because we originally started down the road of where you could just plug it into the container, but then what's the point of having the layer? I like having the layer. And eventually he figured out how you can keep the layer and plug it into the container. So
okay, I'll check that out. Cool.
Hey, this is Uday. James, I have a question. So you're talking about the Lambda profiling tool, right, which gives you the better option, or runs against multiple configurations. Is that available out of the box in console, or how do we, let's say I have a Lambda before I want to deploy it. How do I, go through that?
Yeah, so it's actually not in the console. It's an open source project on GitHub. I put a link in on the article I linked to on the deck, but if you search for AWS power tuning tools, you should find it on GitHub fairly easily. It's also deployed on the serverless application repo as well. So if you want to just deploy it straight into your account, you can do that there. But it's a really, really useful tool. It gives you visualizations and the results, and it can be very surprising what the results are. Several times I thought it wasn't worth running because I thought I knew the answer. And then when I see the visualization, there's something I didn't realize, and I turned out I was wrong. So I've gotten to the point now with production things, I just run it all the time. It's part of the pipeline for building.
Got it. Perfect time for me. We're going to go to production in a few months. So I will run that against the Lambdas. Yeah.
And actually, what's interesting now is that, for a long time, the 3 gig, 2 virtual CPU core, isn't that much bigger when you think about it than, 512 meg function. But obviously now when you look at the new limits with 10 gig and the 6 cores available, there are certain types of function that can be dramatically faster if you increase the memory. So it's not so much things that are, waiting for callbacks or network resources and stuff like that, but things that are network bound, for example, or they're compute bound, can really be a lot quicker. And in some very odd cases, you can find that the acceleration and speed offsets the cost, so that it ends up being roughly the same price, or really within a fraction of a thousandth of a cent.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
You're on mute, Dan.
Question for Wayne. You have a camera on. Like, I do have a question for James.
No. I can ask another one while we're waiting for people to think. On the event bridge, James, I know you mentioned the replay of the archive, and that was something that I had thought about before it was announced. So I was very pleased to see that. What level does that work at? Like, let's say, for example, I add a new rule to my event bridge, which is now going to service a certain microservice or something like that. Mm-hmm. Can I replay to just that one rule, or am I replaying to the whole bus? And obviously, ideally, all of my rules would be idempotent and be able to listen to the replay. But I'm just wondering, can you replay to just one rule?
You can. So yeah, it's pretty neat. So what it's basically doing is it's siphoning off every single event, but it also adds an attribute to every event indicating that it's now an archived event. Now, in regular replay, your application probably doesn't notice or care, but having that extra flag on there gives you a lot of power, because you might choose to play archived events only to certain rules or to different buses. And so you can build some fairly elaborate routing by doing this. It's surprisingly flexible in what it can do. I have a blog post on that one too.
And so does oh, okay, you got a blog post and everything. Does a particular replay then have a sort of an identifier or a?
Yeah.
I see. Okay, so I would part of my rule filter criteria would be okay. I see.
Yeah. And so the great thing is when you set up the archive, you can set it with a TTL. So essentially, if you only want to keep the last 7 days or so, then it will automatically delete older events as they expire. But then if you then want to bring a service up and you want to play every event from since 6 o'clock this morning or midnight, you can then select that time range and play that back in. So what I thought was interesting about this is one of my first jobs when I left school, which is nearly 20 years ago now, was in real-time trading, where we built exactly this because we had a service that went down fairly frequently, and we had to rehydrate it to get it to exactly the same state. And this, what they've built in terms of this feature, is essentially that. And so it's very powerful if you have a very busy system doing lots of events, and you want to stand up a dev environment that's exactly the same state or handling exactly the same quantity of events. It gets around all the kind of hacks and things that you otherwise do to make that work.
Yeah, it sounds really powerful. Oh, I'm gonna play with that.
Yeah, it's a cool feature.
Thanks.
Who's next? This is unique opportunity, folks.
I've got something, but it's not directly technically related. So, I mean, as a DA, you probably don't get this kind of question, but like how, we're in like the TAM or SA or DA roles. Do you find yourself explaining to companies like the value proposition of serverless versus other methodologies, and how do you sort of broach that at like an executive level in companies?
Well, a lot of it, I'm really wanting to talk to people who are interested, and then because often when you speak to people, they're not that interested. So if they're interested in keeping doing what they're doing, then that's great. And really, most of my time is spent with developers who are wanting to find a better way of doing things, but they don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
The answer isn't always serverless. I mean, there's plenty of workloads that are not going to work with serverless. But I'm more interested in well, what is the right section of tools? But I think most of the time, it's not even so much a technical response, so much as understanding what position people are in these days. Because, as I'm sure all of you are in this position as well, as developers, we have smaller and smaller teams. We're expected to do more and more. A lot of the things have failed us in terms of project managing our way of applications. We simply have to make applications adapt and keep up ever more quickly with new ideas that come along all the time. And so really anything that helps you do that more quickly with less of a chance of being paged at 2 in the morning is something that's worth considering. And there's also the fact that often many of us don't have time to learn new stuff all the time. We need to be able to take the majority of what we know and adapt slightly. You can't take it. You can learn 10% more each time, not 90% more each time. So really trying to help people with what they currently know and how that fits into whatever serverless can do at that point in time. But definitely, my job, the best part of my job really is that I don't work for marketing, I don't work for sales. I work for the Lambda team, and I get to talk to customers about, well, this is how the product works and how you can get the most benefit out of it. But I also get to take feedback straight back to that team when people say, well, it doesn't work for me because of these reasons. And so it's more of a two-way conversation between the people building the product and the people using the product than a sort of traditional evangelist type role.
Super, thanks.
Really is actually fascinating because you get to meet, I've obviously met a lot of developers in the past in lots of roles, but in this role I get to meet a very, very wide range of developers all over the world. And the interesting thing about serverless is it's moving at different speeds in different regions. And when I talk to customers in South America, many of them are using serverless to really leapfrog out of on-prem. in a way that I haven't really seen in many other regions quite as much. But I also see this different themes and different types of application being built. You know, serverless clearly has extraordinary power for certain types of workload. You know, for interactive workloads, it's good for startups simply because of the fact it can handle the traffic variability so reliably. But also for things like data processing, there's really nothing like it if you get the engineering right. So we see a lot of people producing HPC workloads. And you know, some customers who are doing some things in many respects aren't that complicated, but they got used to doing them that way. You know, they're doing things like the image processing or video processing. They suddenly realize when they can take this approach that it actually becomes transformative in terms of the amount of time things take. So it's interesting getting to speak to different developers in these different positions who I would otherwise never meet unless I was a DA.
That was our big hallelujah moment, was where's Waldo on massive, the company I was with, Reverse Architects chips for the new iPhone comes out, and we were at a microscopic level, and we had to perform, you know, ever increasing scale of where's Waldo for certain things, and serverless changed the world there for us.
Yeah. I think if you know, obviously these opportunities to continue to reduce the amount of code in places, and so if you're going to code anything, and that code is focused on the really importance of your app that make it valuable to your customers, that's got to be the ultimate goal of this. That you know, so many projects I used to work on, there's so much code that's boilerplate for connecting to databases or handling authorization or, you know, managing state somewhere. There's all of these different things you just suck out. So I do think it's really fascinating what you can build, but I'm also seeing that there's more and more opportunities for different types of workload. I do think these changes we're seeing with machine learning coming through the pipe with products like SageMaker will come into the Lambda space fairly quickly. And I also think IoT as well. There's a lot of capabilities there with serverless that, you know, haven't quite been realized, but actually it's a really good fit. You know, it's a lot of the same sorts of problems where you have devices emitting data, and a serverless application can handle that relatively easily. So although we've all gotten fairly used to a certain type of workload that's serverless, I suspect that's going to evolve pretty dramatically over the next couple of years. I think it was someone at Google said, we all tend to overestimate what can be done in 2 years, and we dramatically underestimate what can be done in 5. And I see that here at AWS because, you know, there's so many things being built all the time. There's so many different directions. You only notice around the 3-year mark, it seems, that we're in a really revolutionary different place than we were just 18 months ago.
So, anybody else? I can shoot a question. I like asynchronous messaging, and there is plenty of services to choose from, like not just SQS, SNS, Kinesis. Now you have managed ActiveMQ and RabbitMQ. How EventBridge? How do people go about choosing those? And maybe elaborate on the use case that you mentioned for Kafka and Lambda connectivity, because that's a great way to start deploying. This is an answer about migration to Mark. Like, you can start migrating workloads using asynchronous messaging.
Yeah, so when you look at the messaging services in AWS, there's some overlap between some of them, and so on the surface you can look at things like SNS and EventBridge. They seem very similar, but once you start looking at the different features and the capabilities of them, they start to then look actually fairly different. And then you start to realize when you can plug them together, they start to get new capabilities. So I often think, you know, EventBridge plus SNS and EventBridge plus SQS is radically more powerful than any one of those services by itself. But a lot of the time, it's just knowing what the endpoints are, how it works more precisely under the covers than just, you know, the top level stuff. Now, with other services like you know, Kafka and MQ, it really depends on what you're coming from, because if you're using those services already and they're already parts of your application, then most of the time there's not going to be any urgent need to switch across or change this. You want to build those into your flow. And so I think, yeah, a lot of these new releases, the fact we can accept those into your serverless development creates these kind of hybrid serverless environments where some of the data is still running the same way as it used to, but now you're building this new functionality serverlessly. But when you first start to build things, often the excitement is to just tear everything down and build it all from scratch. We don't necessarily need to. I think it's really important to figure out what you can use and what you have that works. If you've got Kafka clusters working in your application, there's no urgency to tear that apart, unless there's some significant issue or feature you cannot build from where you are currently. But I think the general question about learning AWS services is a tricky one, because last time I checked, there's 165 services, and most of us don't need more than 20 or 30 of them, most likely. There's 5 or 6 of them that we all need, and you have to sort of deeply be aware of the aspects of how they work. But I know people who are new coming into AWS often feel that they need to learn all of them, and you kind of burn yourself out trying to do that. So I don't think it's necessary to try absolutely everything, but there are some foundational parts that are worth knowing. I mean, when you look at serverless, IAM is still incredibly important. The more you know about IAM, the better you are as an architect. It is that way. There's the compute side with Lambda. The messaging services are hugely important. I think the more you know about those, the more you are likely to decouple your applications properly. And then there's the database side that DynamoDB is kind of often very difficult to get your hands around to start with, but it's something where we almost gave up a couple of times in my last job, but we're glad we pushed through it, because suddenly it gives you access to this amazing scale that you didn't have with RDS, any sort of RDMS before. And so I think there's sort of chunks of space and different services that are worth breaking apart and understanding. API Gateway is another one. And then there's some services like step functions I think are really powerful for the roles they can perform, but aren't immediately useful to people who are new in the space. I think you have to get to a certain point before you realize you need to plug that in somewhere.
That's awesome. To add something to what you said, when I was listening to Adrian Cockcroft talk, like he was talking about serverless first, he now is revising that to step functions first. That's the power. It's because it's full workflow that you can start.
Yeah. I think, step functions, the enterprises that should be using it are the ones I'd like to speak to the most, because when you think about people who have messy backends and they just become totally inflexible because there's too much code gluing things together, step functions is one of those things you can wander in there and just make it work. I think a lot of people when they're new to the space like the idea of step functions being this very simple workflow when they're attaching 2 or 3 services together, and they're probably overthinking it a little bit. It's really, if you've got an application where S3 is triggering Lambda, triggering SQS, it's probably not necessary. And then it depends on how your application is architected, because within one service space, step functions makes a lot of sense. But when you look at multiple microservices working together, not always. You might find an event bus is a better choice there. But it is an interesting service.
I got a related question on that. You're just talking about new people and trying to learn information overload. I'm actually due to repeat my certification soon, because I think it's been 3 years and it's probably expired. I realize you're not really in the area of certification, but just was wondering whether you could comment on this. When you're looking at that stuff and these things keep changing so quickly, and not only the new services coming online, but actually the restrictions and features of the existing services also changing. How does that work? Because I can remember like 3 years ago or whenever I last did it, there may have been a question about talking about S3, and it might have been trying to get at the point of the read after write consistency and making sure that people understand that a write of a new object is different than a replacement, right? Because back then, when you create a new one, it was strongly consistent, but when you replace, it wasn't. Now it's all strongly consistent, which is amazing. But if that question was there now, it would be really confusing on how to answer it. Now, presumably somebody goes through and weeds out those questions.
Yeah, I think the training and certification itself is eventually consistent.
Yeah.
That's the problem. But I also think the reality is you have to accept you're going to get 5 to 10% of the questions wrong because of that.
You should include it in a blog post, that line.
Because the way the questions are made up, it's not just that one or two people in training and certification. They bring in all the heroes and all the people who are considered experts in the space, and they have people create questions, try out questions. There's a whole process behind how they build those exams, and so there is definitely a lag between new things happening and questions appearing. But I don't know the answer for sure whether it's the gamble of, do you answer the question the way it was or the way it is now?
Yeah.
And it's a tough one.
I think every few years they completely replace the curriculum, and like this is like the new version of the solutions architect exam or something like that. But I guess it would be the in between phase would be the difficult. How do you answer it to the best of your knowledge, or what you think the answer is?
I found them to, when I took the exams, I found them to be really unusual in that it's hard to practice for them. And I know there's a lot of these sort of cramming things where you're supposed to just memorize a bunch of questions, but actually they're hard to practice with, especially if you're not using this stuff every day. But of course, people want to get the exams so they can get the job that helps them use the thing every day. And it's a bit of an odd game that people are playing. But I think, the solutions architects ones, you can definitely learn for, and you can pass those if you put in the work. I think the higher level ones are really difficult. Like if you're not basically working in these services all day long, it'll be difficult. I mean, even people who work here who do it all day long, many would not pass those exams. They are genuinely very, very hard. So, it's a lot of kudos to people who pass all these. I see people on LinkedIn who have, 7, 8, 9, 10. I mean, it's incredible because this stuff is hard. It really is, especially when you get to the specialty exams. It's just very, very difficult.
But some companies give them time because they are judged by number of certificates company has. So it's not like you're a consultant and then you have to do that on the side. It's a full-time job. So the company would.
Yeah, I think for most new developers though, and this is the space I'm so interested in because we desperately need new people in this industry. Like we just desperately need people, and I want to excite people who are problem solvers essentially, and they come from all walks of life. And often people are coming into this space where they feel like the quantity of certifications is important. But really, it's not. I think if people have a cloud practitioner and they have one other, that's good enough. They've shown that they can learn the basics of what's going on. Now it's time to build something.
For sure.
I think
it's useful.
Yeah, I think everybody needs the basic one, associate one, because it's awareness. You realize how little you know. Like there are 4 quadrants of knowledge: knowing that you don't know, not knowing that you don't know, knowing that you don't know, and then knowing that you know, and then like a dolphin, last one where you're just not aware of your skills. So that first quadrant has to be tested or has to be challenged through any level certificate, associate level, before you can give anybody access to the cloud, any cloud.
Yeah, I think if people take that approach to learning one of the associates well, and not just for passing the test, but kind of understanding the material of what it's covering, I think that serves them really well for then going into building their first application, because then it's a matter of trying it out, seeing what you get wrong, seeing how things can be better. One of the people here who I think is amazing at this is someone called Emily Shea, who's in our BD group. And she didn't study computer science at college. She doesn't write code or anything. And about a year ago, she decided she wanted to build an application to help with learning Chinese vocabulary, and went upon teaching herself serverless. So I've seen how she's done this. And if she started with a cloud practitioner and then started building things, getting it slightly wrong, finding better ways of doing it. And over the course of 6 months, built this fairly scalable solution. And she gave a presentation at reInvent about how she got to this point. But to me, that's the model of how people should start approaching this. That many people are not going to have computer science degrees, and I don't think they even need to necessarily, because it's all about really this problem-solving capability, and then how you go about turning what it is in your mind into reality. And I think a lot of people can do that.
Can you paste your name here? I did not catch it, and I'm probably going to misspell, so we can watch her talk.
Oh, Emily Shea. So her last name is spelled S-H-E-A.
S-H-E-A.
S-H-E-A. So but Emily's, she's got a blog going as well where she talks about, and she takes the approach of each couple of months she wants to build something, generally has no idea how to do it and sort of figures it out. I think in reality, that's how we all do it. I think people think that this is going to be like the Matrix or something where we simply start typing nonstop. But most people I've ever worked with, we get given a task to build something, and there's that moment where you go, I'm not quite sure how to build this. I don't know the best way to do this, and you go from there. So she's really just going through the same process earlier on, and as you do it more, the cycles get shorter, and you can do more complicated stuff. But I think it's really a rite of passage for building software.
And another thing there is, once you understand what you want to do, you're not necessarily always building it from a blank page. Like, I'm a big fan of the CDK. I know you didn't really mention it today. Maybe there were no big announcements, but the constructs that are available both from AWS and third parties who've added their own, it's so quick to pull together the chunks of applications, and it's fantastic. So, again, back to your point, like if you can get to the point where you understand what it is you want to build, there's lots of things to help you kind of assemble the pieces.
And of course there's not one way. That's the other thing that people don't realize, that most of these things have a very, very wide range of solutions. And so that's the other fascinating part, because typically whenever I've built something and it's gone into production, it's only once the rubber hits the road you realize down the road how you've not built it correctly, and what could be better, and how you'd like to refactor everything, and one day you'll be a good developer. And actually, I think that's essentially the journey, that you build something and you fine tune it, and it's
iterate.
It's more of a practice and a craft than it is an absolute, binary yes or no. You did it wrong, I did it right. I think there's a lot more to how these things get put together. I find that fascinating because over the years, and it has been quite a few years now, the technology's changed a lot. Machines are a lot faster. The networks are great, but a lot of the human side of how we build these things actually is still the same. But I think the biggest challenge we've got now is just how we invite more people into this space, and it's a really serious problem. We have to find a way of doubling, tripling the number of developers that companies have available, and we don't talk about it enough.
But there is also psychological change within companies. They treat most of us like roofers. You build the roof, you go. But what you're talking about is like gardener. You're constantly taking the weed out, making it better. So mindset and expectations have to change. It's a two-way street. And what I feel like, maybe you can talk to people at Amazon. I've seen on Coursera, after pandemics, lots of people lost their jobs. So there was a Coursera and Google are working on some kind of certification. There's like 6-month project to get you cloud ready. You don't have to have university, and they promise they're going to hire people. So maybe you can do something like that.
Yeah, but I think another question I get a lot from developers who are new in the space is, how do I get a job? And I think the thing that's changed here is that this is less of a role where you send in a resume, and more actually about, well, if you put a few projects out on GitHub and join in a couple of open source projects and throw in a few commits, that speaks volumes. And I know there's all this debate about whiteboard interviews and things, but really people I've known to start rolling up their sleeves and start producing projects, you want to hire those people. And I find it exciting because for years we've gone through this chase with resumes. It's just kind of ridiculous. Whereas now you can actually show what you can do. And I think that's a great way for a junior developer to get the first job. But another thing I was going to say is, another thing I think is fascinating is, one of the mindsets of getting out of is, of course, building everything yourself. And it's almost impossible today anyway. We all stand on the shoulders of other people to build things. But in the serverless space, it's even more extreme. Because I think I've got to the point now where every line of code I ever write, I wonder if I'm supposed to be writing that line of code. And it doesn't matter if it's billing systems like Stripe, or you've got Auth with Auth0, or you're using queues with SQS. There's all these different tools that you can pick up and plug together. And we're talking about CDK. It's such a powerful tool to be able to weave all these things together. And when you think about just not too long ago, getting a server, that was a big deal. If you wanted to have a queuing system, that was an even bigger deal. And now we do it in 1 or 2 lines of code, and we spin these things up and tear them down. But really, it's about knowing what tools are out there, so you don't go down the road of building something accidentally. You can just take it and plug it in. And it's not always within AWS, of course. It could be all over the place. But it's kind of interesting when I meet people and they're trying to build something. I can say, "Oh, do you know this thing exists?" And then they sort of light up and they realize they don't have to spend the next 6 weeks building that. They can move on to the next problem.
This is exciting. Any other questions, guys? We still have 20 minutes. James promised to stay until 8, but we can go longer if you want. Okay.
I have a question, but it's 50% serverless, 50% not.
Sure.
So there's the AWS distro for open telemetry, new on preview. I'm just looking into it and how I know it will be. They say it will be integrated using Lambda extensions.
Yeah.
But for example, do I have to install it on my Lambda application, or do I link it to watch for metrics?
So the way it will work using extensions, you simply attach the extension to the Lambda function, and then OpenTelemetry then essentially works with Lambda that way. I've not done it myself yet. I've only seen the slides, but my understanding is it's very similar to implementing X-Ray, for example. With X-Ray, you turn on a layer, or you have 2 or 3 lines of code you can use instead. But with this, you simply use the extension to activate OpenTelemetry. I should have put that in the deck, actually. It's a really exciting feature. Really exciting to see that's coming through. It does give you a lot more options if you don't want to use X-Ray, you want to use another tool.
James, I made a mistake. I assumed in your slide when you said log extension that's OpenTelemetry because you mentioned Honeycomb. So it's not. So
no, so this is a really specific ask that people who have systems that are producing large numbers of logs, one of the problems is the cost of storing all that data in CloudWatch logs can be larger than the cost of storing with Lambda in some cases, or executing with Lambda. So this is designed for you don't want to have any log file touch CloudWatch at all. You want it to go somewhere else. And so that can help you do that. The reason why it's so complex is because getting logs out of the Lambda environment, there's more to it than meets the eye, because when the environment shuts down, you have to be able to flush the logs reliably out of there. So the API does all of that work to make sure that happens without you losing information.
Cool, thank you. But for Ibrahim, you can start refactoring and then using the native APIs from the vendors. You know where you're sending the logs. Probably if it's Honeycomb, they have their own API, and that's going to let you. And then later on, you just refactor like a gardener.
Yeah, those vendors actually, they've all, I think all of them have now produced extensions and everything that matches what just came out. So if you're using one of those already, you can just plug in directly with what they've got. But I really like this solution because the problem with the layer approach, obviously, if you forget to include the layer, then you've got a problem. Or if there's an upgrade to the layer, you have to go and redeploy a function. There's all these things that are kind of gotchas with layers if you're using that as a wrapper around a function. And so this approach makes it much more straightforward to implement that type of vendor functionality.
I also think this is the first time where AWS goes out to open source communities like OpenTelemetry and what happened for the Prometheus. Google has been doing it for maybe a couple of times, where they rely on open source project where they do CI/CD, for example, and they will throw you many names. But it's good that we see AWS go and, let's say, team up with the OpenTelemetry project or Prometheus. It's really good.
There's definitely a big push in the open source services to push back to open source a lot. You see things like Firecracker and that being open sourced, and many of the different features we've announced, there's either elements have been open sourced or they've built around open source parts. But in what we do, when you look at where Lambda fits into this, open source has a really important role to play. So we're definitely more interested in making it so where there are tools people want to use, we can connect with those. The biggest challenge always is knowing what people are using, because at the end of the day, we don't know what people are running in the Lambda functions. People often forget we don't have a kind of secret source way of knowing what code you're running. And so we rely on people telling us, well, we need this integration or that integration. It's not going to be automatic unless we know about it. So if there are things that are missing, just let me know.
Folks, 15 minutes more. Final questions.
I turned back into a pumpkin at 8 o'clock. So yeah.
So who did not do the survey? Like, we have more people than the survey. James, I added your name. Okay, any final questions, or I'm taking over screen to draw the winner? No? Taking over the screen.
All right.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Yes,
Always
thank
nice
you.
to chat with you.
While you're getting ready, I'll just ask you. I clicked on the Cloud Shell thing earlier today. I thought that was cool. I like the idea. When you mentioned, James, it was one per something, and I missed that. Is it one per AWS account, or is it per IAM person? IAM role, not role. Sorry, IAM user.
Yeah. So when you're logged into the console, that IAM user gets 1 gigabyte. But you cannot create more gigabytes by adding more IAM users. It's essentially 1 per billing user per account. If that makes sense.
Oh, per billing user. So if another IAM user is logged in and clicks, they're getting the same one as me?
No. So if you have AWS organizations running and you have 3 developers, say, they would all have their own separate Cloud Shell allowance of 1 gigabyte. They won't see each other's faces. But inside their accounts, if they then generate admin IAM users, they won't get more. So it's the balance you expect, probably. But
okay, no, that makes sense. Yeah.
the interesting thing is that you get 1 gigabyte of space per region. So,
that is,
although the environment disappears each time you bring it up, you can store your own applications in that space. If you have applications you want to always persist, you can also do that in Cloud Shell. But, yeah, it's a pretty interesting tool. The more I've used it, the more I've got used to it being there. So I'm excited to see what comes with that service.
Cool. Anybody else? So I pasted all the names, 14 names that I did, James, to the wheel of names.
Oh, great.
And then anybody else, I can paste, put their name here. No? So basically, you're going to go to manning.com, choose anything. Like, I really like their early access projects. And then you're going to let me know the email address you use to log into Manning, because then they have to move that product into your dashboard. So ready to start? Spin the wheel. Ta-da, James, almost. Ibrahim, you deserve it. You asked the question. You're still with us?
Great. I am. I'm lucky to see them still here.
So if you can paste your email address, the one you use for Manning website, and then you eventually let me know which product you chose. Take your time. You have to do it before the next meetup, because I cannot kind of have a backlog of the people on our books.
I'll find your email in the meetup group and thank you.
Please reach out to me. You can paste it here. Put your email here. So I'm going to have the transcript of the chat.
Okay.
And then what else? What else can we learn? And I wish this was real over the drink or on the stage, but what can you do?
Yeah, hopefully that comes back soon. It's definitely been a different reInvent experience this year, but I think it's interesting. People are definitely consuming the sessions differently. Where I see a lot of people catching up after doing the on-demand stuff, and that's useful. You can very quickly get those sessions. I think this new wave in January will be useful for people as well. So I'll be watching lots of them too. Every time there's a new service, I'm going to watch a few videos.
And you have a good session, so I'm looking forward to that one. It's about the mindset.
Yeah. Those were 2 fun Chalk Talks last year, because with the Chalk Talks, they're more interactive than the sessions are. And so I set up these projects where I simply created problems and started solving them using these serverless tools, and it was received pretty well. So this time around, I made the problems harder and more extreme and showed how you can use serverless. But I think it's a useful way to think about things.
I will see you there, definitely. I'm excited about those. And then you were mentioning other services. So for instance, like this year, I spent time with a healthcare provider. There is so many healthcare services that Amazon has. They're all serverless, like most of them. So this is just one aspect. And then the machine learning stack, you mentioned that, like top stack is all serverless. So everything new they add is built on serverless. So it's not just about the lambdas, the enabler. They're like the base foundation of everything else we're going to be seeing in IT, I believe.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges is trying to get this mindset of sort of event-driven architecture idea out there a bit more, because it's definitely, there isn't that much written about it. And I know a lot of people I speak to who really understand it well. But then with people who don't understand it, it's hard to find exactly what the anchor points are where you tell people how it works. But when I look at things like healthcare and banking and all these traditional industries that work on batches, and I think there's enormous value for them, but it's just a topic where more and more in my mind I'm trying to figure out how we explain to people what it is.
And I think it's a beautiful way to bring people to the cloud, because it's not to move, everybody goes to the cloud. You can start with asynchronous messaging, bring people in. So lots of you who are here are going to appreciate the link I posted. Tim Bray is no longer with Amazon, but he had this messaging group that's dealing with different asynchronous ways of bringing people in. And I think ActiveMQ was one of the first candidates to bring people on board, because you can still have your hybrid model working in the data center while sending messages to the cloud. So there's lots of good talks here, and Kafka is a new announcement that you brought into the picture. So somebody needs to talk about that too.
I worked on an event bus-based system 10 or 15 years ago, and what's interesting seeing it come back is a lot of the problems we ran into are resolved now, where the single point of failure issue was our biggest problem back there. And obviously these systems being more highly available, that's largely solved. But also the other one I ran into was when you have lots of different services piling on events, these buses, and people changing versions and event structures are changing, it becomes a bit of a zoo. And then what we've done with schema registry, I think, goes a long way to solve that. It automatically just listens to events and generates schema. And then you can download the bindings directly into your IDE. So I think some of the obvious problems with how this event process works, we're slowly working through. But I'm most excited about it because it means, as a developer, your scope of what you have to learn is so much smaller. And if you want to add on functionality, it's so much easier than having to go and beg for time from people who have control over the databases or whatever it is in traditional infrastructure that's blocking you. It just enables you to do whatever you need to do.
And that replay is going to be awesome. I love that concept, especially for like a post-mortem incident, like what the heck happened, and then you want to try and, hey, will this fix address that same thing? I just think that's amazing. I'm looking forward to playing with that.
Yeah, it's one of the great powers of those systems. I remember from a long time ago that when things do break, it's almost impossible to get to that state that caused it. So being able to replay all these events is just a great way to do that.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Anything else, or are we gonna close up early, guys?
Well, one thing I'll add is I hope everybody got my Twitter handle and my email address off that deck, because I know if often when you're using this stuff, you might have a question. So reach out to me anytime. I always like to hear from everybody, see what's working, not working, and obviously regarding features, if you think of something you want to see, let me know as well. It's the PMs will always be delighted to hear from you.
Cool. Thank you. So I hope
Thank you for your time, James.
2020 is over, that the next one is going to be better, and stay healthy, happy holidays, everything you celebrate, and I look forward to see you next year. So, James, thank you so much. I owe you. Be on me next time I see you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been great. Everybody stay safe and have a great holiday.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.